Hi, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Trust in Digital Systems to Drive Performance. I'm Samantha with the Marketing Department at CallidusCloud CX, and I will be your host today. Now, to take a look at our agenda, I will introduce our featured speaker, Steve Sims, as well as very briefly introduce CallidusCloud CX, just for those of you who aren't yet familiar with this somewhat new brand. So today, Steve is going to give us his insights on how employee performance affects ROI. He's going to explain how this relates back to the notion of trust. Now, we all, of course, have our own sense and idea of what trust is, but Steve is going to take us a little deeper into what trust really is at its core and how it's established. So he'll also explain why in the digital age, we actually need to trust the systems we use and how that may or may not differ from human to human trust. And of course, after that whirlwind tour of, and into some rather cerebral subject matter, we will definitely be taking your questions at the end, and I imagine there may be a good number of those, given the sort of newness of this information. Now, moving on to our presenter slide. Again, I'm Samantha, and I've been with CallidusCloud for a bit over 5 years, originally from the ClickTools side of the business. I've been working in B2B tech in various content and communication roles for about 17 years. Our featured speaker today is Steve Sims. He is our Chief Design and Products Officer here at CallidusCloud, as well as a Stanford Distinguished Visiting Scholar. And I might personally add, although it doesn't appear here on the slide, that he's also just a really smart and funny guy, as you will soon discover as he gets into his stuff. So before I hand things over to Steve, let me quickly introduce CallidusCloud CX. And this is, again, a somewhat new CallidusCloud division that we launched earlier this year, so we just want to give you a brief intro. So the brand encompasses our former ClickTools and Badgeville technologies for enterprise feedback and gamification, as well as solutions for customer and employee engagement and learning. The suite also offers several new technologies that drive sales and service performance, which Steve will touch on a bit today. Now, we're not covering much product stuff in depth today, just staying high level and conceptual, but if you do want any further info on any of the solutions, please just jump on over to CallidusCloudCX.com. Now, one last note before Steve takes over, we are recording today's session, so look for an email from us with a link to the recording later. And also, and this is important, please feel free to type your questions at any time into the question area in the webinar interface. And again, given the newness of this material and the sort of, high-mindedness of it, please ask away, and we will address as many of those as we can, time permitting, at the end of the presentation. So that's my whole spiel, and with that, Steve, it is all yours.
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everybody. Before we get going, I just kind of want to give you an overview of where we're kind of headed on this story or journey we're going to take. First, I wanted to just set the thing about how important trust is. If you think about it, everybody talks about ease of use. They talk about motivation and whether people are motivated to do things or not. But there's actually kind of a more fundamental concept, and that's the concept of trust. If you don't believe as an employee, or you don't believe in the systems or in the people you're dealing with, kind of everything falls apart. It's kind of a base human thing. We are social animals. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of start about trust. We're going to talk about the real world business and then kind of circle back around to this concept we call trust-centric design. So, perfect. So in terms of the way businesses look at the world, that all the businesses you work at or own or run, it's all about the numbers. It's all about ROI. And in fact, if you kind of look at how ROI is calculated, the metrics seem to fall into, at least from the work that we've been doing, into 3 buckets. They fall into productivity. In sales, it's how many calls you're making, how many wins you've gotten, and opportunities you've converted into revenue. You may have a quality metric, and the quality metric in something like a service, like in an agent call center, maybe something like CSAT, customer satisfaction, or net promoter scores or level of effort. And you actually even see ROI when they evaluate things like learning management systems, right? What are the pass rates of your material? What are the scores? How long have the people who are using your LMS been spending in that thing? How many courses do they take? They talk about things like attach rate, like for self-directed learning. It really depends, but bottom line, it's all about the numbers. But the real question is, with these numbers, you realize that there are employees generating those numbers. And you really need to get your employees to perform in order to make the ROI you need and to achieve the metrics that you're going after. And so there are really three things about employees that you need in order to drive top performance. And the first is the employees really have to have a certain set of skills, right? Here's a nice kind of cutesy word cloud, but basically these were listed by, I think it was Forbes, the top 15 traits that you would see in a successful, in a productive, successful employee. At the same time, employees need commitment. And, if you've ever worked with somebody who kind of doesn't really buy in, they're kind of lethargic, they're kind of sitting there by inertia, they don't really go very far and they don't really stay very long. And in this kind of new system, new age of working where people are jumping jobs often and things, you have to have people for a certain amount of time, or even training them and having them go is not making any money. So in order for them to commit, they usually need to believe in these different things. They need to believe in the management vision. They need to believe in the people they're working with, the business processes, and even the ways they're measured for success. And finally, while it's good to have, let's say you have an employee who has a lot of skill and she has commitment, she's got the fire and all that stuff. The reality is, in order for her to perform, she really needs to be able to cooperate with other people and cooperate with the company to the end goals. Individuals don't drive successful products on any scale anymore without the help of other people. And so really they need cooperation, where everybody knows, I'm not big on reading slides, but I'll read it for you here. Everybody knows what the goals are and everybody's working towards those goals together. And you say, okay, well, if you think about it, where does that come from? That actually comes from almost evolutionary psychology, where we're roaming the plains of the Serengeti and we're hunting water buffaloes or something that's far bigger than us. And I say to someone else, you grab the spear, go behind the rock, I'll chase the water buffalo, and when the water buffalo goes underneath, you spear it and we'll have dinner. Otherwise we go hungry. And it's that kind of cooperation that's allowed human beings, socially to survive. It's kind of what separates us. But in order to do that, in order for you to go behind the rock and hold the spear and make sure that I'm going to drive the water buffalo to you and it's not a trick, you need to trust me. So really the question is, what is trust? And the answer is kind of surprisingly simple. Let's just talk about trust and how it's established. The answer is, from the dictionary, trust is reliance on the integrity, strength, ability, surety of a person or a thing, or a confidence in that thing. And what turns out is that trust actually exists on a number of levels in everything you do every day. It exists in every interaction you have between people. Your friend says you're going to show up at some time, and whether this and that. It exists in the social systems you use. So, I think the audience probably has Facebook, Insta, Snapchat, whatever you call it. In social systems, it's every day. You're using that both in analog and digital. And finally, it exists in the workplace. And so a question that, in order to set this kind of talk up and how we're going to drive performance in the workplace, is to kind of walk you through how trust actually realizes itself in the world you live in. So the first thing is to talk about trust between people. Okay, so for anybody who has ever rented an apartment, bought a house, or even signed a job, right? Start a job. You do not have a relationship with the entity you're dealing with. And in that case, what happens is society has set up what are called assurance systems. I rent and sign the lease with you. I mess the apartment up, you take back my security deposit. That is the assurance. I ruin the apartment or burn it down, you sue me. right? Those are all different assurance systems built in. Even companies, when they hire you and say, hey, we'll go to arbitration or not, that's an assurance system with a kind of a compromise thing in it, right? So there's no relationship. They set up these things to talk to each other, to handle that. Then the second stage is kind of, if you're in the early stage or there's no relationship, what ends up happening is you start to rely on what's known as trustworthiness. How trustworthy is that person that they're going to come through for me? And it turns out basically that there's kind of two elements to it. One is familiarity, which is actually a subset of the next one, which is reputation. So reputation is usually third-party validation. You vouch for someone else that, hey, I'm vouching that Sam is really good at this, and you should trust Sam to be your host for the webinar. And so you're taking my word for it if you believe me that Sam is going to do a good job for you. What is interesting, though, is one element of reputation is actually familiarity. And this is kind of what celebrities lean on all the time. So what happens is you may have a favorite celebrity that you've been watching, has been on TV forever, even from when you were a kid or in the movies or what have you. And because of the frequent exposure, because people are used to seeing faces and seeing common and trying to recognize friend from foe, going back to evolutionary psychology, things that are familiar are more trustworthy. And that's why you tend to believe why celebrities become spokespeople and celebrities do different things, because they're familiar, and that familiarity builds trustworthiness, which is on the stage of trust. And finally, over time, a track record of positive outcomes with someone, especially in uncertain situations, leads to trust between those two entities, two people. So trust can be built in certainty environments that are pretty certain, but in uncertain environments, that's when someone does something for you, and kind of, again, using some psychology theories of reciprocity and coming through, allow you to kind of bond with that person and have those kind of interactions. So how does that work in social systems, and how does it work in digital systems? Well, a little precursor, let's just talk about how some stuff you know, and kind of explain that those same things of assurances, familiarity, and reputation are mirrored, or they try to mirror those things in the digital systems you use. So my first example would be Amazon. I buy something on Amazon, maybe eBay. I don't like it. There is an assurance system. I can return it. I can return it within a certain amount of time. In fact, they even give me the box with the label, so I can send it back to make it easier, right? The second kind of thing is a kind of a hybrid system like Airbnb. So Airbnb uses assurances. They do give refunds, this and that, along with the assurances of certification of the third party. We have screened every person that you use, right? And so we know they are a good host and not a stalker or something else, right? I hope that's okay to say in the weather. So given that, right, you use that kind of combination of assurance and the pictures that you go through along with reviews in kind of a hybrid system to evaluate where you're going to stay. And believe it or not, the more times you go back to Airbnb and look at the picture, the more familiar the place is as well. That's why more pictures is generally better, makes you feel more familiar, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing, which is really Yelp, and Yelp is purely a reputation system. If you think about it, it's an open system where they can say that Lucy's hamburgers are better than Joe's hamburgers. And I know, and the way I gauge that Lucy's hamburgers are better than Joe's hamburgers is I look at the overall rating, but I also look at the number of people who have given 4.5 stars. And if one has 1,400 stars and the other has 5 stars, then obviously I know that the sample sizes are out of whack and that Lucy's is better, or whichever one I said was better, I can't even remember. But you get the point. So the key thing to realize here, in the workplace, all of these things happen as well. People just don't talk about it, but it's actually more crucial than ever. When you're messing with somebody and something doesn't seem fair and there's no trust, that's when people are unhappy, that's when they leave, that's when they perform poorly. And it turns out that, at least in some surveys, the reason most people leave is because either they don't like their manager or they don't believe in what they're doing, right? And those things all kind of happen through these trusts when trust breaks down, right? So let's just talk about these digital workplace systems a little more. So trust in digital systems is different in the workplace. It's often used with terms like credibility and security and certainty and reliability. That's one key aspect, which is kind of built up in our approach to trust. What we actually realize is there's a bigger challenge here. So in 1994, way back when, there's a really great paper, a bunch of papers written by very famous guys at Stanford, Byron Reeves and Clifford Nass, about human beings and their interactions with computer systems. And it turns out that human beings ascribe properties to the digital systems they use. When something doesn't work, you get mad at someone or some entity. And in fact, some later reading we've been reading is how actually people not only ascribe properties to the digital systems they use, but to the brands and the companies that house those digital systems. So if I'm an employee, even if I'm using a third-party system and the system is breaking, I may be blaming my own company. It's not a guarantee that if I hate the company, the software, it's kind of a shared thing. There's a lot of hate to go around, right? So given that, there's a lot of things we need to look at in order to fix this problem or to deal with this challenge. And the first, let's take a step back and talk about the relationship with the manager. And in the past, employees' trust relationship with the manager is kind of interesting. The employee is thinking, will the manager be fair with me? Do I have a good relationship? Because deep down, you kind of know that your performance review is not just based on your work, but the perception of your work. The whole concept of 360-degree reviews, where they ask other people, what do you think of Sam or Steve or what have you, is often tainted by the bias that that person has towards you. And the trust you built up with them, whether you've delivered or not, whether you go out to lunch with them, whether you're in a social circle, it's multifaceted. And that adds complexity, right, to managing your job career. But what's interesting is the present is changing. You can see a ton of different products coming out here. They're talking about 360 reviews. They're talking about pulse surveys. They're talking about LMSs that measure your training and all these different things. And what ends up happening is data on the outcomes from all of these systems they're interacting with are now being blended with the input from managers and peers to give you a more holistic view of everybody's performance and everybody's interaction, like what you're doing every day. Do you, if there's a common community where you're helping other people, do you share or do you not? Do you help answer questions or do you not? Many leading companies have those kind of things where you see a big, I don't want to bring brands up, but bring one kind of environment to another where they're trying to get collaborative work out of everybody. And so all of these things are very, very important. So what does a successful trust system measure? Because now that we say, okay, we get that it's more data and human mix. We get that the systems have to measure. What does it measure? Well, it measures things like internal stuff, like the activities that someone would do in, let's say, a CRM tool, or the activities they would do in a call center tool. It may involve qualitative things, like a survey tool, like Sam mentioned earlier. She's part of ClickTools, which is part of the CX suite. And ClickTools, which is a survey platform, actually goes out, sends things to customers, and the customer feedback comes back. And if that's part of the employee ratings and how they're doing, that's kind of an interesting thing. It's not the same as it used to be, because it's harder in the past to gather that kind of data. And finally, there's human input. There's the input from management and the conversations, possibly in a call center listening in on a call, or in a sales call listening in on a call, to do coaching and things like that, along with these other digital system interactions, which kind of lead for the need for a system that can hybridly blend and measure all of these things. So now that we understand how we're measuring, what are the traits of a successful trust system for an employee that you need to measure? And I've kind of laid it out here in kind of five kind of basic fundamentals. Number one, there have to be rules, and the rules have to be clear. I have to know what I have to do, what is expected of me, what do I get. Very similar to a thing you would see if you were actually entering a lottery or something socially, like American Idol. I'm going to go, I guess it's off the air, but I'm going to vote for somebody on Who's Got Talent, and my vote's going to get counted. And if my person wins, then something happens, right? And it works a certain way. Same thing with the employee system. The rules have to be clear. Second thing is I need feedback. A lot of jobs don't have feedback, and that needs to be transparent, and it needs to be timely in its manner, right? I do something, I get the feedback, good or bad, and it comes back soon enough so that I can take action on it. The system must work accurately. So if I'm measured on the number of calls I make and the call counting system isn't working, that's a problem because my bonus depends on it. If I need to get a certain number of surveys back and those surveys aren't coming through, that's a problem. And so accuracy is key. The next concept is fairness. So if you think we're in there are some interesting rules about what's fair, especially in kind of certain performance scenarios. So if you have two service centers and one runs the day shift and one runs the night shift, if I just measure based on the number of tickets taken, it's not fair because one of those time frames is going to get more than the other. So an example of something that would be fair would be gauged on the percentage of things you catch and answer successfully versus pure counts, as an example, or having different quotas or different targets based on those kind of things. And lastly, the system should be non-exploitive. And what I mean by non-exploitive is the right information needs to be presented to the right people and not sent willy-nilly. And it has to be kind of back to the honesty and fairness up front. The rules kind of have to be known. So a successful system will employ these techniques. So let me just show you a couple of things. Here's the only kind of little bit of plug of a product that we have. So this is actually a product for service call desks around service desk for Salesforce. And per the 5 list of things you can see here, this area where the arrows are, that's actually a real-time feedback mechanism for how an agent is answering tickets and handling tickets. On the left is actually transparent goals or quotas or whatever you want to do it, more promotional soft language because service agents, it's harder for that. You really want to be, they have a tough job and so you don't want to be, as harsh with them. But it's things like, am I closing cases on the thing? Am I getting high enough customer satisfaction scores from the surveys I'm getting? Am I closing tickets? Am I updating my contacts? All of those things are the wheels from left to right, and those are radial progress bars to show how they're doing. And every time something gets updated, an activity or something else, in real time, it comes in and updates this. Same thing over here. There's a quick little contest thing with different leaderboards to incentivize stuff. Now, leaderboards, as long as they're used in service desk in like a friendly, competitive way, and they're accurate, and they trust that the answers are fair, people are okay with it. Again, clear rules, clear things, understanding who it is makes for okay. What's interesting is back to the fairness thing and all that stuff. If you were competing 2 disparate groups, it doesn't work. 2 of the same with friendly competition is okay, as long as everybody's good with it, right? And then here's some more examples of just the 5 kind of basic tenets. You can see the pointer for clear rules. There is a guide, an easily accessible guide that anytime they get stuck, I'm like, what do I have to do again? They can click on the button and see it. You can see accurate system operation because each key statistic that, in this case, the agent needs will be updated and will be accurate. We've done some things where actually in systems where people call and they ask, they say, hey, can you check that this number is correct because I did 10 of these or I did 12 of these and I only see 11 of these things. And it may just be that the queue is processing, or something, but they, they care. And in terms of non-exploitive, this is kind of an interesting thing. I just wanted to give a little story, which is that when we focus groups and rolled this out, we included surveys that would come back, and we would count the number of surveys, which was important to the company, of a score of 8 or better. So 8 out of 10, right? Anybody who knows like CSAT or NPS or any kind of stuff knows that 9 and 10 are advocates, 7 and 8 is okay, below 7 you're in trouble. The agents can't do anything about it. And so when we set up this system, they really liked the fact that they were getting everything in real time, so they had plenty of time to change their behavior before their once-a-week meeting with their manager, with the call center manager. But the most interesting thing was the feedback in that non-exploitive thing is They wanted to know what the distribution of bad survey results were as well as good. So one of the changes we made to this particular program for this particular customer is that we actually included the bad surveys as well as the good, because they wanted to see it, as long as they knew exactly where it was going, and they knew, say, hey, if my manager gets to see this, I want to see it too, because that's what's fair. So bottom line of all these things, what you're seeing in these examples are examples of trust-centric design. Trust is essential to human performance and the employee performance in the workplace. You know, you can talk motivation all you want, but without trust, there is no motivation. I need to trust you in order to be motivated and excited to actually act on the excitement or the motivation or whatever drivers there are there. The digital systems that kind of are in the marketplace now complicate that because now feedback systems in many roles now, in many jobs, are blended. They're blended between human kind of subjective performance and qualitative and activity or volumetric performance measured by machines, by systems. And so we believe that using these approaches, like using trust-centric design, where feedback and transparency are bedrocks, where things are clear, where things are non-exploitive, and where things are accurate and have ways to show that to the employee, you can build on that and build a successful user-centric design. And again, the key here is everybody cares about the employee, about the company and the bottom line results. What people miss is if you don't align what's in it for the people who are doing the work for you, you miss and miss severely, and often people don't understand why. It's a much more complicated world, but fundamental values of trust and trust and kind of verify, and designing the right kind of programs will really lead you to a better experience both for your company and for your employees. So, any questions?
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that very much. And let me just encourage our attendees to please, again, if you can find the question area in the GoToWebinar interface and just go ahead and type them in there. And all questions are welcome. I always like to say the old adage, there are no stupid questions. So let me get to the first ones that we have here, and forgive me as I read them aloud. So Steve, our first question is, what are the impacts of corporate culture and leadership on trust in digital systems? Let me read that again for our audience, just because that's a bit much. Okay, what are the impacts of corporate culture and leadership on trust in digital systems?
I think it has to do with belief or the commitment aspect of the first stuff we talked about here. Corporate culture and leadership basically is something that the employees have to believe in. If the systems and the way they're measuring you and the way you're being evaluated and the way you're being promoted are not in alignment with what is coming out of the mouths of leadership, then you have a discontinuity. There's a problem with how you perceive and how the employees perceive it, and that can cause a lot of issues. So yeah, so I think it's top down. You have to be aligned from top to bottom. Whatever your vision is, your goals of your team, of your group, of this. If the systems and the reward structures and all those kind of things don't line up with that, there's a problem.
Yeah, then that just gets back to the whole idea of not only having clear rules, but the idea of fairness and accuracy and non-exploitativeness and all of those things. They have to be really cooked into the larger culture in order for it to have the broadest positive effect. Now, then I've got a couple questions. Let me group them. Feel free to answer them separately, Steve, if you want to address these separately. But I've got a question on whether or not you have any data on millennials and trust in the workplace. What a fantastic question. I was wondering that myself. And then related, and address this however you wish, related is, does the age of the employee affect how he or she trusts digital workplace systems? Fantastic questions.
Sure. It's a mouthful. Yeah. So in terms of millennials, so there's some interesting things. Millennials, actually jump jobs a lot. So the average millennial will actually have, I think it's 4 jobs before they're 32, something like that.
Wow.
Quote me a year off or not on the age. But what ends up happening is, given that they're probably even less prone to trust of the environment in the company, probably because they may or may not care. That said, they do, because the millennial generation, I would guess, this is not something I've researched, but the use of digital systems and familiarity with technology is an advantage and a strength of that demographic. And so they do have more inbred trust of the systems that are often used that they see. So things like, I don't know, Facebook, Snapchat, Insta, whatever it is, they're used to it. And so because they're used to it, that sets it up for better adoption and better understanding. In terms of does the age of the employee affect? I think it may just affect the disposition and the reaction to what's going on. I think millennials, the trend or kind of the anecdotes are that millennials are much quicker to react than older generations in terms of being slighted. And there's kind of a more grin and bear it and see it through in the older generations. But I don't think they react to the systems differently in terms of trust. They may react to systems differently in terms of onboarding and time to proficiency and how they use the system. But in terms of trust, I think if it looks fair and it's rewarding people and it's accurate, I actually think in some ways maybe it'll even have because of the familiarity again with the tech, the millennials actually may be an advantage for understanding the system faster. But in the end, everybody will go to the same place.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's even a cynicism in millennials because they actually have such a knowledge of the way digital systems work that they know when you're referring to like volumetric activity and qualitative activity, they know that stuff is being tracked loud and clear. And do you suppose there is any cynicism to being unfairly tracked?
It depends. I would say that's more job role than that. I mean, there have been some articles and some blogs and that kind of stuff that talk about millennials' willingness to trade privacy for access and functionality.
Mm.
And so when you see that kind of thing, that would actually make you more trusting because you really don't care if you're getting the functionality you like, even if you're giving your information away. Again, though, employee systems are a little different. You're expected to do something. It's monitoring you. If you're not doing a good job. I don't know. Anecdote. My own son was working gathering leads, doing lead generation, and he made a list, and the list had bounced in the system. And so it was interesting his reaction because until they proved that it was the system sucking in and making a mistake because they hadn't deduped the list in the system, not in his request, he was concerned that he was going to get blamed, and he didn't think that was cool until they showed otherwise. Mm. So there's a real life example of I guess he's still a millennial. Yeah, he's a sophomore in college. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Well, that actually isn't a bad segue as we're talking about different types of systems and how trust varies across different types. So the question is, does trust differ across different types of digital systems? For example, social, email, project management, timesheet, etc.
I think it depends on. That's a toughie. I think I would only say the magnitude of how much I care. So it really depends on the force of something, right? And I also think the roles. Again, it depends what it's being measured for and how much of your career or your progress is dependent on it and your own reputation, right? Because at the same time, you need to trust these systems represented accurately because you want your own persona and your own reputation to keep growing amongst your peer group and your company and all of that, right? Mm-hmm. So, email. I don't know if there's really a violation of if there's really trust in the email other than is your email delivered or not, right? Project management, timesheet, and expense and stuff like that, that's only if it's surfaced you're always late submitting your timesheets, or you spend too much money or something like that. You know, it depends on the function, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question, or is that too roundabout?
Well, I hope that answered the question. Please type in if it did not answer your question. But that, you know, the reputation stuff, that kind of brings me back to the whole millennial thing. I think, have you seen, Stephen, your research on digital motivation and reputation? Do millennials care more about sort of that statusy, you know, the badging type of stuff because they've just had it their whole lives?
I think yes, but you have to be careful. So what ends up happening is reputation, yes. Badging for badge's sake is not always a great idea, and kind of you can lead to all sorts of fatigue and kind of numbness from the whole thing. But look, reputation does matter. You know, put it this way, it's something as silly as Pokemon Go, which kind of had its heyday, and it's kind of on the back nine, although I still like it. And you know, in Pokemon Go, it matters what level you are, and so what ends up happening if you kind of ground your way all the way up to level 30 or something, and all of a sudden they have a new thing that comes out, you may come back and pick it up. They're all kind of references from like video games like World of Warcraft, where people will leave, but they'll keep their license going and still pay the $50 a month or whatever it is, 25, 50, just because they don't want their character to die. So yeah. So the reputation means a lot. It's all about context, though. You know, it's like the people, look at Stack Overflow, look at the people who answer questions in the technical forum, or the people who answer, you know, in any of those kind of situations. That's all reputation.
Yeah. Okay, and I've got one more question here, unless we see any more come across. And this is a very interesting sort of a development-ish question. And the question is, how is trust-centered design the same or different than human-centered design?
I think it's kind of an adjunct. I was thinking about whether trust-centered design sits on top or actually below human-centered design. Or user-centered design. I haven't really come to a conclusion in my own brain yet. But again, back to what we were talking about before, user-centric design is about design thinking and putting yourself in the shoes of the user and thinking about things about how easy is the system to use, how can I make it easier, how can I remove friction, how can I take the behaviors and design the behaviors into that product that the users want to do, and that kind of thing, and work on their motivation. I think trust is an even more fundamental thing than motivation. Trust is like, if this thing doesn't work, I'm not gonna play. And if I start to play, it's gonna sour my experience quickly. So I'd say probably trust is an offshoot of user-centric design, and it's just an important lens to look at the way your systems are interacting with your employees.
Great, thank you for that. And last call for questions. And as we allow any final stragglers to come in here, I would just say, first of all, thank you so much, Steve, for your expertise and your knowledge on this stuff. And audience, do look for more on this subject. I think we're going to be talking about trust-centric design and related going forward, and it's sort of a brave new world. So I think I will sign us off now, and of course you can come visit us on the URL that's on the screen. You can either just go to CallidusCloudCX.com, or if you want more information on the product that Steve was showing, that CMO, that /CMO is short for Service Motivate, which is the formal product name. So visit us at any of those locations, and of course on all of our social channels. And with that, a final thank you to our attendees and to Steve. I'll close us out. Bye-bye.